Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing a wrap-up for the month of August. This is 4 books. August was a really good reading month for how my reading has been going over the last year or so. This wasn't all I read in August. I also read a bunch of middle grade graphic novels and already did a separate wrap-up for them, so I can link that so you can find it if you haven't seen it already. But of the novels I read, the first was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a Gothic horror novel that I was a little bit hesitant to pick up because of the horror element, even though Silvia Moreno-Garcia is an author whose work I've really liked in the past. So I waited on reviews from like everyone I trusted on this before picking up a used copy myself and deciding to read it over the summer when I was feeling really good and solid about my reading and felt like I didn't mind a little bit of spooky. This takes place in Mexico in the 1950s. I would say one of the things that this has in common with other books by this author that I've read before is a sense of historical fashion and glamour and atmosphere that I really appreciate. This is definitely a book that like serves you the Gothic tropes on a platter. It's got an intrepid heroine who goes to a crumbling mansion in a remote village where the family has dark history and all of that stuff. It has all of the vibes. The protagonist is Naomi. She is an urban socialite. I think she's like in her early 20s. She's an interesting protagonist because she's both like very glamorous and fashionable and a social butterfly, but also very, very smart and an academic. She is studying. She wants to get a master's degree in anthropology, which her father says he will let her do if she does this thing for the family. Her father has received a disturbing letter from Naomi's cousin who made a possibly ill-advised marriage a year prior to a man from a family of English descent that Naomi's family doesn't really know all that much about. In this letter, the cousin Catalina seems mentally disturbed. She seems out of her mind. She claims there are ghosts in the house, all of that stuff. And so Naomi is sent to visit this family to check and see that her cousin is receiving appropriate medical care. I have to say, I kind of identified pretty strongly with that basic premise of sort of trying to step into a family situation that is difficult and trying to figure out what's best for a family member, a loved one. So even though I think Naomi is a character who has a fundamentally very different temperament from myself, I really easily identified with her in the beginning of the book just because of the nature of her mission. I found this was a book I could sit down and read in pretty big chunks at a time. It isn't fast-paced or anything, it's pretty moody, but I never ran into any like stumbling blocks that made me want to put the book aside and stop reading, and I was kind of worried that I would because of the horror. I think the horror in this was, for me, portrayed in such a way where I was reading it from a bit of a distance where it's all like very scary for Naomi, but I was watching the stylish craft of the book and it didn't frighten me to read it. Once Naomi gets to this house with its oppressive atmosphere and secretive family, she too starts having some weird dreams that might be visions where what's real and what's not start getting blurred. I should mention there are some frightening scenes of a sexually explicit nature if that's going to put you off. There's some spooky discussions of eugenics. That's always a frightening topic. And there is whatever is going on in this house that is causing the abnormal experiences that Catalina and Naomi are both having. Because this is a platter full of Gothic tropes, I think you have from the beginning a pretty clear idea of where it's going. By the end, the house is going to be in flames and someone's going to be running away in a nightgown. Technically, it's Catalina in the nightgown, not Naomi, but whatever. I ended up really enjoying this book. I gave it 4 stars. I think the thing that was most difficult about reading it for me was actually keeping track of some of the family history that we learn. I wished I had like a family tree to refer to And once I got to a point where I thought like all the major spoilers that a family tree might provide had already been revealed, I did go and look one up online and it helped. But I did start to lose track of some of this information we were gradually learning about this family. There is like a little hint of a romance thread throughout this that I enjoyed, I think in part because it is so understated and it ended on sort of a sweet little maybe note. So overall, if you're looking for a spooky season book recommendation, I'm sure you may have seen this recommended elsewhere before, but this one does get my stamp of approval. Next is a YA novel. This is Chaos on Catnet by Naomi Kritzer, which is the sequel to Catfishing on Catnet, which was a surprise 5-star read for me that I read practically in one sitting and loved. This was still a page turner for me, but I didn't love it quite as much as the first book. These books are both very near future YA science fiction with an AI plotline. They are about a girl named Steph who has grown up with her mother kind of on the run, moving from town to town because they are on the run from her father. And the confrontation with the father happened in the first book, and now Steph and her mother are finally planning on settling down and staying in one place. They've moved to Minneapolis, and I've never been to that area, but I think you can tell that there's a lot of like real local knowledge in this book, which is fun to read because it gives you a real sense of place even if you've never been there. We have a new point of view character that Steph meets at her new school named Nell, who is from basically a cult. Members of this cult seem to get very strange instructions from a leader that to Steph seems like it might be an AI, like her friend Cheshire Cat. Nell's mother has gone missing, so she has moved in with her father's family. There are 4 adults in that household. They are polyamorous. Meanwhile, there is this app game that Steph and a bunch of people she knows start using that sends you on weird little adventures that seem fun but may have a more sinister purpose. This continues to have a lot of queer characters, good friendship stories, some very wholesome character development, especially where Nell and her family are concerned. I thought I was going to be annoyed with her as a new major character in the series, but I ended up really loving her perspective by the end. Where this falls flat for me is in a few places. First, this feels much more like a purely plot-driven thriller than the first book did. I feel like the first book spent more time doing some more fun stuff before it got deadly serious. This gets very high stakes very quickly and then it doesn't really let up. Second, I felt like Cheshire Cat, the AI friend, was an underutilized POV in this book. They were kind of the best thing about book 1, but in this one it seems like Cheshire Cat gets sort of relegated to being a useful plot device, the AI friend that can help make technical stuff happen. And third, and most minor, there was at least one big plot twist in this that I felt the groundwork hadn't been laid for leading up to it, so when it happened I didn't quite buy it. That said, if you liked the first book as much as I did, you are probably gonna wanna read the sequel. If there are more books in this series, I would read them. I gave this 4 stars, which is only underwhelming because the first book for me was 5 stars. Next is a book where I do have a physical copy to hold up, even though I read this on ebook, because after I read it, I decided to buy copies for people I know for Christmas. So I have Christmas gift copies stocked up in my closet. This is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by Kingfisher. This is one of the Lodestar Award nominees this year, and it was the one that I sort of thought was going to be my like 5-star favorite of the batch. I was surprised that for me this only got 4 stars, which honestly made me sit back and do a little like think about the state of my reading and like how I was enjoying things, because this is, I think, everything I wanted it to be, but it didn't go above and beyond. So still, obviously, a book I highly recommend. This reads like young YA. The protagonist is 14. The writing style is very easy to read. It's not dense at all. It's very quick. It's written in first person, and I think the protagonist Mona's perspective is just pretty simple and straightforward. Mona works in her aunt's bakery, and she has a magical gift for bread, which in this world is pretty small stuff in terms of a magical gift. It's not really considered very useful or very powerful. And these sort of lesser magical gifts aren't something you're really trained in this world. It's sort of figure it out as you go. That said, things start to go downhill for Mona when she discovers a dead body in her bakery where she works and gets framed for the murder. She does manage to walk free, but it becomes clear that both she and the murder victim are targets of someone who is trying to eliminate magic users in the city. Now, this seems like it's going to be the main plot of the book at first, the "oh, someone is targeting magic users in the city" plot. The people of the city becoming more paranoid about magic users, people like Mona disappearing or leaving the city because it no longer feels safe. But that part of it, that mystery of what's going on there, is actually only the first act of the book. There is a bigger plot that gets into the works later on. That's where the defensive baking comes into play. There is a big threat to the city, and Mona might be the only one who can save the day. The thing I really liked about this, the thing I think I most appreciated, was what a healthy attitude this book has towards the failures that have to happen on so many levels. For a situation like this to come to the point where a 14-year-old has to step up and save the day and be some sort of hero, how many adults in the chain here have to fundamentally fail at their jobs? And it isn't without some sympathy towards the adults that are failing at their jobs, but there's also just this very fundamental understanding that Mona should not have to be doing any of this. I think a little bit of my disappointment in this was just that as a fantasy book about baking, it's not quite as good as Sunshine by Robin McKinley, which is my favorite fantasy book about baking. I never really expected that I would have multiple, fantasy books about baking in my life to compare those. So, take that with a grain of salt. I gave this 4 stars. I still persist in the certainty that eventually I will read a T. Kingfisher book that will be 5 stars for me. I haven't quite found it yet, unfortunately. And then last but not least, I did have a book in August that was finally a 5-star read for me. This was actually pretty predictable. This is The Queen of Attolia by Megan Whalen Turner. It's the sequel to The Thief, the second book in, I think, a 6-book series, the Queen's Thief series. I hold out hope that every book in this series might be a 5-star read for me. Wouldn't that be wonderful? This series takes place over a number of different fantasy kingdoms in a region that is fundamentally Mediterranean-inspired. The narrative approach that this book takes is significantly different from the narrative approach that The Thief takes, but I think the reasons that this book is a satisfying read are very similar. The Thief was told in first person, but Eugenides was actually a fairly unreliable narrator in that book. This is told in a sort of third person that I think has gone out of fashion, at least in YA in recent years, where it's not necessarily stuck in one person's close POV for the entirety of a single chapter. This jumps around a lot to what's going on with a lot of different characters, and you're not really close inside anyone's head. It's called The Queen of Attolia. She was a character we met in book 1, although very briefly. In this world, monarchs are referred to by their country name as opposed to their given name, so she does have a given name, but we don't even learn it until quite late in the book. So this book is named after Attolia, but she doesn't really take center stage until later in the book. And when she does, it's very satisfying. Because I think what we get in the climax of this book with her is sort of the same thing we get in the climax of book 1 with Eugenides, which is basically competence porn. You're told throughout most of the book how good she is at what she does as a queen, but you don't really see it. You see her through most of this book presenting a fake facade, and you sort of know it's fake. But you don't see what she's really capable of until the end, and it's very satisfying. But for much of this book, I would say Eugenides is still the main character, and this is far more of a coming-of-age story for him than book 1 was. At risk of being a little spoilery, but it happens early in the book, he does lose a hand very early on in this story. And a lot of his character arc throughout the rest of the book is how he deals with that. I assume that because this book was published back in 2000, it didn't go by sensitivity readers for disability or anything, and I'm not really in a position to judge on those merits, but I will say that to me, the way Eugenides handles this situation, which is mostly very badly, feels realistic. It's not flattering, but it feels like it makes sense. I continue to like the use of mythology in this series. I think we only get one full, myth that we cut away to tell the story of in this book. I think there were more of them in book 1, but I like the way the gods are used as the magic within this world. So far there isn't any other magic in this world. The politics of what's going on with all the kingdoms in these books are very intricate. There are power struggles between the 3 main kingdoms that we've spent time in over these 2 books, and then also in this book the threat of this looming imperial power becomes a much more significant plot point. This book also features what I assume is the first half of a probably 2-book romance arc. I think whether you ship this early on is probably going to depend on whether you find the intimidation bits sexy or not. It took me a while to get on board with this, but I'm assuming that book 3 is going to continue to develop this relationship. Anyways, for me, this is the first series in a long time that I have hopes that I will be able to read the whole thing in a relatively short number of months. I'm focusing on Hugo reading, but as soon as I'm free from Hugo reading, you know what I'm gonna be reading. Anyways, that's it. Those are my 4 books that I read in August. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you think. Feel free to leave a comment. Let's chat. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.